Okay. Hello and welcome to the Team by YouTube channel. My name is afuabayayi and we are parenting, homeschooling, working and churching with a tablespoon of humour. On our platform, we share with you everything growth, learning and development for families. Make sure that you follow us on Instagram at Team Bayayi. I actually did a series of 4 interviews with other homeschooling mums who I greatly admire, greatly respect. And the material was just so rich that I felt it absolutely necessary to share the content on this YouTube channel for you guys to watch and share with others that you feel may benefit. Now, Alberta is a home education consultant. I just love listening to her speak. You'll see exactly what I mean. Her son has been private school educated, he's been to a Christian school, he's been to a state school, he has been homeschooled, and they are now exploring the option of Flexi Schooling. There were plenty of book recommendations that were given throughout the talk, and I list all of those books below in the description box. Grab a cuppa and enjoy. And I remember hearing her during a live with someone else who I follow called Tombra. And Tombra's actually a friend of mine within the wedding industry. And so I actually run my own business doing wedding and event design. And I set up the business so that I could homeschool. That was the motivation behind actually launching that company. And so Tombra kind of started this platform during the lockdown to kind of have live discussions with people, and Alberta was one of the people that she had. And I remember just thinking, gosh, this woman is extremely inspiring and extremely impressive as a mum. And I knew that at some point we were going to have some kind of a conversation. Hiya!
Hi, Afia. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you.
You okay?
Yes. I slapped on the makeup, because I was looking a bit tired, looking a bit rough. And so I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. Thank you so much for joining this evening.
Pleasure.
So first of all, please introduce yourself. Tell us a bit more about you and your family.
Just wanted to say thank you so much for that glowing introduction. I even had my son in the background going, Mom, you sure she talked about you?
Children, honestly. Yes, I'm talking about your mom, young man.
So thank you. I'm totally honored to be here. And hi, everybody. My name's Alberta Stevens. I am a home education consultant. I'm a mum to 1. I live in London. And I'm also a single parent and a Christian. I write home education resources. I also blog about home education experiences. And outside of that, I've worked in the international development sector for a couple of decades, put it that way. So it is an absolute honor to be here. One of my favorite subjects to talk about is homeschooling. And chatting.
And you know what's really bizarre? So I have Forever Fontaine is Candice. Hi, Candice. So Candice and I actually went to school together years ago, and I had the flyer up in my WhatsApp, and she said, "Oh my gosh, like that was a mum of one of the boys that used to go to my school, and she's lovely." And I said, "No way!" Such a small world. Such a small world.
Okay.
So hi Lenore, welcome. Hi everybody. So this is really where I wanted to begin. The fact that your son did go to school and then you took him out.
Okay.
So what led you to that decision?
Well, let's put it this way. I never thought of homeschooling. And actually, I can remember a conversation I once had with a friend of mine after I'd complained about schools, and I'd moved my son probably 3 times from different schools. And
really?
And she said to me, pray that God doesn't tell you to homeschool one of these days. And I was like, return to sender, no way.
Wow.
So it was something that had never, ever been on my radar. I just thought, I've always had a learning environment at home. We've always loved books. We've always done experiments. We're always learning at home anyway. But I always I paid deference to schools. I felt like they were the experts, and whatever they said goes. And in fact, I was one of those moms that spent my entire time wanting to strategically place my son in whatever the best schools were.
Right.
So the process started probably over a period of years. That we started off in a private school, and after 2 years, I just thought this is a complete waste of time, waste of money and time.
Right.
A tiny school, but and even though academically it was very, very good, but I thought the environment didn't suit him. He wasn't quite happy. He was probably two of I don't know, 50 or so other kids that were there that were black.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of complexes coming up, even from the age of 4, where I remember one morning getting him ready for school, where he said, "Oh, Mum, you know, why can't I have blue eyes, and why isn't my hair silky like the other kids in class?" But I believe that's never going to be possible. So I just, but it stayed with me. So these were some of the things that I felt, okay, let's begin to explore. I need to do something about this, because clearly he's feeling, even though I'm black, his dad is, grandma's black, but the entire environment that I placed him outside was always white.
Right, right.
He began to feel uncomfortable in himself, even from that early age.
Okay.
We moved to a church school. And again, just after a year, I just thought, this is not, again, just socially, it didn't fit like the right environment. He was coming home with language and behavior that I thought, I'm not sure about this, even though
really?
it's a Christian
school.
Yeah, well,
right.
It is, and it was a lovely school, don't get me wrong. I think the fact is that many of the teachers weren't Christians, and it was surrounded in a socially deprived environment that meant that, as Christian as the school was, the kids went home and did their thing, you know.
Sure.
Were probably latchkid kids anyway, that kind of stayed in after school care till 6 o'clock and then went home, did their thing. So anyway,
yeah.
And we landed at the age of 8. He landed in a school that I was actually quite happy with. I loved the school. It was a free school, and this is where we met Candice.
Okay.
Academically, they did a classical education curriculum, which I loved. And socially, it was okay, fairly West London. And the mix, in fact, was, again, okay. There were far more black kids in that school than schools that he had been to in terms of dynamics. But what I didn't realize was that as much as it was a sort of relatively balanced socially, it's funny, even at 8, kids begin to know how the social strata worked. So the black kids played by themselves and the white kids played by themselves.
Right, right.
You're black, you're meant to be urban, you kind of spoke a certain way, you're into certain games, and that's that. Now, he didn't fit in either. He wasn't as cool as the other black kids.
Right.
Pretty proper. He clearly didn't fit with the white kids.
With the white, right.
Then it's either that or then you're with the gamers. So he began to, and then the social awkwardness just started to grow. That then began to manifest in lots of behavioral issues that I thought, this is not like my son. And
right.
Complaints of, oh, sorry, we had to put Kynan out, you know, of school today and put him outside because he was rocking in his chair, or because, you know, he put his hand up when he wasn't supposed to. He answered a question, you know, asked a question when he wasn't supposed to. You know, the usual drill, right?
Yeah.
He's got a curious kid and obviously really engaged.
This is it. Yeah, yeah.
These things began to pile up, Afia, that it was draining me. I couldn't focus in my work because I was getting... And the more anxious he got, the less he was able to regulate himself. The more anxious he's got about the social environment, that it just got to a point where I could see he was so unhappy. And one day he came home and said, "Mommy, I don't like myself anymore."
Wow.
And that I can't begin to explain how.
I can imagine. I can imagine.
And I thought, no, this has to stop. You're going to come home and we're going to figure what's going on with you. We're going to figure out what's going on with this school thing. So I had less than a month to figure out homeschooling.
Wow.
It was literally, I made a decision and I kept him in school within 3 weeks. By the time we got to the October half term, I pulled him out and he never went back.
Wow.
And I had that 3 weeks to sort of figure out, what am I going to do? I have no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah.
In another journey for both of us.
So take me back to private school, because I find that is the aspiration almost for so many parents, you know, to get their children into private school. And I've had a number of conversations with people, and they sort of feel like when you're a Black child and you're growing up in England, whereby we are the ethnic minority, there are barriers, and there are challenges. And so a lot of parents oftentimes feel that taking their child to a private school is going to help overcome some of those barriers because of the type of friends that they will have and the type of people that they will mix with and the way that they will speak and carry themselves. And so it's almost like a ticket, if you like, to have access to certain doors opening. And so I actually have a number of friends who have their children in private school, and they will straight off the bat say, to be honest, we're not really paying for the education, we're paying for the type of friends that our child is going to have. And I think that's quite interesting. Was your motivation behind private school, or did you actually think that private school provided the best type of education and you just wanted the best?
Hand on heart, I think I certainly did believe all of those things myself. Let's face it, you know, it's hard being a Black person in the West.
Yeah.
And I know the way I speak has certainly opened doors for me. I'm not going to lie. I know it has. Prejudice, but it has. But at the end of the day, I think character is also important. And private school for me wasn't just, it was the type of education, it was the social environment, and it was also the extracurricular activities, which meant that I didn't have to run him around to do so many things that I've often had to do, because most of the private schools provide that extended day extracurricular activities. So I echo that. But I think whilst all these are advantages, I also think that there are costs. The cost that the child becomes alienated from themselves and their own culture, because they're so immersed in this sort of, not just a Western education, but very elite that is foreign to who they are. And they become, and I mean, I've seen adults and friends who have gone through that system that struggle. You know, they may be successful sort of in terms of work, but relationally, and and in many ways, there are costs, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's, you might have the language and you might have the airs and graces, but you still don't quite belong. And how do you explain that to yourself when you from where you should belong in? It's and I think we manage that. And for me, that has always been something that is important to me. Identity is a key part. And even when my son was at school, I was fastidious about making sure that aspect of his learning was something that his spiritual and cultural identity has always been my responsibility, not school.
I love that. I think that's so, that's really quite, you've put that very, very well, and that's quite potent. And so you then moved him to the second school, and that wasn't working because, you know, there's the whole issue of belonging, and then you're homeschooling him. So someone might sit back and say, but with homeschooling, doesn't that present even more social issues in terms of, you know, because people have this concept that, you know, it's almost like we live in a hole with our children. And so could you kind of shed some light in terms of, are there social opportunities for him with you homeschooling him, and how does that compare?
So I call it the S word. I mean, when I decided to homeschool, I contacted like key members of my family and friends and said, like, I'm just making myself accountable just in case anything happens to my son. So, you know, to do. You know, and most people were like, oh, Betty, you'd be awesome at this. I think you'd be great. Go for it. I never had anybody who said, oh gosh, what are you doing? The only area that I did have people sort of put a question mark was socialization.
Sure.
How would he be socialized? I mean, he's an only child. I think it's a little bit that bit sweeter where there are several children in the home, so you just have your own little hub. But I have an only child who's an uber extrovert and loves to be out and about with other people all the time. So I remember having this conversation even with my brother, and he could see some of my photos, but and also you've got to be careful when you're posting not to post photos of other people's children.
Children, yes, absolutely.
I hardly ever post things of him with other children. So I remember him being very careful in the way he approached this, but he was like, but Alberta, how are you sure that he's socializing and he's mixing with other kids? My brother and I went to boarding school, so literally we were parented by other children. So his idea of school is being with other children.
Yes.
So I said...
And was that in this country, or was that...
No, that was in Sierra Leone. I went to boarding school for about 3 years. And so I sent him like 40 photos in one go of him doing several things, out at museums with other children, out in the park 3 times a week with other children, going on trips to, you know, various places, learning places with other children. I mean, literally, we structure our day so that we are in till about 1:30 in the afternoon, and then we're out like for the rest of the day.
Right.
To a point where I thought, okay, that was so much of a priority that I was exhausted most of the time. So I had like...
Come on, I hear that. Trust me.
My station has to stop.
Yeah.
We need to have at least 2 days where we don't go anywhere and we stay.
Yeah.
Okay. So to answer your question, I think homeschooling presents far more opportunities for children to be socialized within the value sets that are important to a parent than you would get at school. I think school, in fact, has far less opportunities for socialization because really the children have less than an hour to play. And when they play in very sort of clandestine sort of groups, and the dynamics are always different. They hardly have time to really talk. And when they're talking, it's usually about topical things that they've seen on screens. So they're not really expressing their desires. Have play dates. Whereas I think with homeschooling, when kids get together, it's free play. And often they're able to talk. They're able to, you know, I see my son sitting with other kids and they're just talking. They can play, but they'll sit down and chat. Now, I've spent a lot of time with school kids and I hardly see that. You know, they'll play games, but they don't talk.
Actually converse.
Right.
You know. Yes.
And the range of conversations, and equally he spends a lot of time with adults as well. My son's probably more comfortable talking to adults than he is even to children, which you don't get a lot of with school kids because of the dynamics between the teacher. There is that power dynamic, so kids know adults stay in their zone. Right? So,
And what's really interesting about that is that and so I see some it is going to be saved on the page, and hi Tombra and Candice who actually, you know, was with your son has been making comments along, and she's been saying that, you know, she's like, yes, she's high-fiving everything that you're saying, essentially, you know. But the point that you made about your son being comfortable around adults, you know, it's so interesting because, you know, we're Africans. So I'm from Ghana, my husband's from Zimbabwe. And culturally, you know, there is this very
there's this huge distinction: adults, children, respect your boundaries, that type of thing. Adults are talking, please go somewhere. And as you said, because the children they're not always with other children their age. Oftentimes they're in groups, and it's not determined by age. So they're used to mixing with those who are older, they're used to mixing with those who are younger, and they're used to being around adults because the social situations are very integrated in that way. And we've had to kind of figure that.
Afia, that is real.
That is reality. That is real life, right? And we've had to kind of try to figure it out, because sometimes, we'll find that, like my son will, okay, so let me give a perfect example. There was one time when we went away for a few days, and we had a few people that we knew help look after the children. And one of our friends who was taking my eldest to swimming, he was like, "So do you know where you're going?" And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, so why do you have the sat nav on then?" And he's asking a genuine question, but she kind of took it as, "Excuse me, young man," and this is, and so we've oftentimes had to try to figure out how to navigate around this, because they don't have that fear of adults as much, and they are very forward and very confident, and it's like, how do you even get that balance, being an African and respected, and they're not being disrespectful, but it can be perceived because there is that confidence there. You're absolutely right. So that's quite interesting.
Line, I think, because I also believe in some kind of deference for adults. I think it's not just an African thing. I think it's a Christian thing, that there should be some form of order and authority between parent and child. And that doesn't negate that I don't respect my child as a whole person that is wonderfully and uniquely made. But I also want to feel like at least he knows the buck lies with me. We struggle with that, and I think generally that's one of the things that I've struggled with in homeschooling, because we spend so much time together. He could often feel like we are friends and we're on a level, and get crossed a lot. I have no space to have private conversations that for his own heart that I don't want him to hear, to grow up quickly. And we try to negotiate that, to say, look, I'm going to have a conversation with my friend. Do you mind going to your room? It's not that, it's just because it's my friend. And but he could learn so much about me that which I don't mind, but I just feel like it's sometimes too soon. He will grow up too soon. So that's me personally. And we lived with my mum until recently, so there is that intergenerational dynamics. My mom is very Sierra Leonean, and so some of my parenting strategies are a little bit out different. Yes.
Yeah, I hear you.
Where I would have a debate with my son, and I would ask his opinion about certain things, or things that would freak her out when I would apologize to my son, and she'd be like, "Hey, why are you apologizing?"
Oh my gosh. And you know what's really interesting? I remember not that long ago, actually, I remember watching a documentary, and it was kind of following different children of different classes and how they ended up in life, depending on, it was mainly to do with class. And what they found is that middle class children, private school educated children, and that sort of thing, and children especially white middle class homes, they are engaged in conversations oftentimes, and that validates their opinions and their views, and therefore it gives them confidence. And so if they go into the GP and the doctor is asking about their symptoms, you answer the doctor, it's not a conversation between the adults about the child. It's, and so these things, they actually really help the confidence of the child. Yeah, absolutely.
And so these are reasons why for us, dinner time, sitting around the table, so important. It's just these things we never miss, because even when he was at school, being at the table 6 o'clock, 6:30 was integral to our daily lifestyle, unless he had an activity, because that's when we talked.
Right.
That would ask him, how was your day? You know, he'd ask me questions, and he's relaxed. You know, we talk around the table. And I know that there were other family members, again, a very African thing. When you're at the table, you don't talk, you eat your food. You
Yes.
don't talk. Like, but I talk at home.
Yes.
And we will talk about everything. He'll tell me about a film he watched, what he thinks about the characters, the book that he's read, or something that happened at school that perhaps when I picked him up, he was too preoccupied. So dinner time and bedtime are usually when we have our most meaningful conversations. And it's on a level. It again, certain friends, when they visit and we're at the dinner table and adults are talking and my son's chipping in like he's part of the party, and we're like, what's
going on here? No, that's so interesting. And so going back to the fact that you had a literally 3-week period to transition from your son being in mainstream school to then homeschooling, how did that work with work? You know, because I can imagine that a lot of people that are thinking, that are watching this or are going to watch it, who might be considering homeschooling, one of the big questions is, how do we navigate this financially? Or if you are a single mom, how does that even work practically?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Can I take it in 2 parts? How does it work? Because I think work is a separate thing and being a single parent is another thing. I was working from home at the time. My work involved travel and going to clients and whatever, but I pretty much controlled my time. And I think had I not had that kind of flexibility, I probably would have been less inclined to think about homeschooling. So because I knew that as long as I did the work, as long as I'm available to the client when they wanted, I was okay. So it meant at the start that I would kind of get up really early and do a bit of work and then make sure that I was ready at the table at 9 o'clock for us to start school, put in 3 hours, and then I'd give him an activity and then I'd go and do something a few hours again. But the problem came with his need for mixing with other children, which meant that I had to take him out and and as you know how the homeschool communities go, the children go off and play and the parents talk.
Yes.
A conversation looking at my phone thinking, you know, I need to be available to my clients. I need to check which didn't make me available in either space properly. So that created a tension for me at the beginning of my homeschooling journey, just navigating between work. Even though I had flexibility, I still had to be available. And also it's a matter of, I think, virtue. If you're being paid for a job,
absolutely,
do it. I struggled. I'm not gonna lie. It was the kind of job that I did. It was intense, it was busy, I was project managing, you know, so I had to be on the ball. And I also didn't want to do what I know a lot of homeschooling parents who do, which is that they would probably do a couple of days with their children and then they would leave them with somebody else for a few days. I felt that the transition period was already quite stressful for my son, that I had to be with him. So after 3 months of trying to do both, I decided, no, I can't do it. So I quit my job. I felt that I needed to learn how to home educate properly, and once we got our rhythm, he was happy, I was happy, I'd go back to work. We started in October. By January I stopped working, and then I was more present at home, and you know, all the things I'd learned I had time to put in place, and that's when I think our homeschooling journey really kind of, you know, went in full swing when I was pregnant. not kind of thinking, oh gosh, okay, kind of, you've got to finish this reading.
Yes.
Go back. So I think it's hard if you are trying to work full time and to do it, but it's not impossible. I do know a lot of homeschool parents who work, and it works if you are able to give, when you're available, the time you allocate, you are there and you're present. And when you're not, then there is somebody else. So if you have, I know people who, husband and wife, do a tag team, you know, somebody works 3 days a week, the other person 2 days a week, and you swap. But as long as there is somebody present with the children all the time, some people will drop off their kids to a kind of co-op, or you know, or a nanny, whatever works, and it is possible. It's definitely something that is doable. Many people do it. In fact, I don't know that many homeschooling parents who don't work, even if they're from home or doing their own thing. Almost every one of them.
Some hustle or something. Yeah. So you took time out and then you went back to work after you had established a rhythm or a way of homeschooling that worked for both of you.
I did, but I must admit that going back to work second time round, or wanting to go back to work, actually I never did, but wanting to go back to work second time round was more out of necessity than because I wanted to.
Sure.
Into the rhythm of homeschooling, I loved it. I fell in love with it. I saw the results with my son. We were both learning. I was on a journey, and I was filling the gaps in my own education that I never got.
Same here.
You know, and also not just that, but I think I found the confidence to pursue my own purpose that I knew, a call that I felt God had over my life that I never dared. I knew it was there. I've been toying with it, but I was always too scared. And the moment I thought, if I can homeschool, if I can unplug from that system, I certainly can unplug from this system and pursue what I know God is calling me to do. And that's really what I did. So homeschooling not only transformed my son, it transformed me. Wow. It made me realize that I don't need to be in the nexus of this big old matrix system, that I can really just do me and it's okay.
Yeah, 100%.
Of a sort of authentic life. So when I mean, being a single parent, it got hard, of course, you know, when you have a tag team of somebody else, you know, who's paying, and you know, you can be a little bit more entrepreneurial and sort of different things that you could explore. But then I felt as time went on, I began to feel anxious about money. And but again, what was good is that I was able to have these conversations with my son.
Right.
Say, look, I love what we're doing, but I have to be a grown-up. I have to make money. Sit around talking books and movies and I hear that. Somebody has to pay for this, and it's keeping me up at night, and I'm becoming unhappy. So I have to come out of this bubble and think about, you know, how to make this work for both of us.
Sure.
So by January this year, having homeschooled for nearly 2 years, I thought, you know what, let's look at you going back to school so that I can find work. And my son, like I said, he loves being with other children. He doesn't like school. He doesn't like the structure.
Okay.
He loves the engagement with other children. So he was happy to explore school again. And we found a school that had homeschooling kids transition into the school system before, and the head teacher, in fact, one of the first conversations I had with her, she said, look, I totally believe in homeschooling. If I had my way, I would homeschool all the children in my school one-to-one, which is really amazing. It's not something that you would hear very often. And so she was very open to working with me, with my son going back, looking at his homeschooling work, you know, making sure that he fitted in quite well. And then, you know, less than 8 weeks later, we had lockdown, and I was only too pleased to be.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, because by the time we had lockdown, I just thought, what have I done? He should be home. I never should have.
Go back.
Yeah.
And so where are you now on the journey? Are you working around him homeschooling? So is he going back? Has he gone back to school, or is he staying at home?
We are home.
Okay.
We are exploring the Flexi Schooling possibility, just so that it gives me, I mean, I'm doing Homegrown Sunshine, and that is my main thing at the moment. Lockdown gave me that space, or him being at school allowed me to explore ways that I could take what I had done with him and share that with other people.
Yeah.
That's the blessing that, you know, he wasn't there, and I didn't have to pay attention to his needs all the time, which meant that I could really repackage and I really had a burden about that there is a lot that I felt I could also bring to the table, looking at the gaps from what I'd learned in that time. So him coming back, once he was back at home, because I'd already done the groundwork of, you know, what I wanted to do, it was easy to manage homeschooling and work. So I felt that, you know, I can do this. I'm not going through a learning curve anymore. So and also he's more independent than he was 2 years ago.
Sure.
You know, once we had our morning time and we had a conversation about what we're learning, I could say to him, okay, well, you look at this, read this, we'll come back and talk about it. I'm going to go do my work. And we are good. Right. Yeah, and he's now 10 rather than 8. So things have changed, and we changed. Yeah.
And you know how you mentioned Flexi Schooling? That's something that a lot of listeners would never have even heard of before. So could you explain what Flexi Schooling is?
So Flexi Schooling is one of the options that you have actually at schools. So your child could be at school full time, or they could flexi school, whereby they're at school for a period of time and at home for a period of time. So some people will flexi school, like we're exploring 2 days a week where he's at school and 3 days where he's at home. Now, it isn't something that schools jump into willy-nilly, because there is a funding implication. Your child being at school, they get a budget for your child.
They get money for your child, guys. That is what the government are not into. No one's promoting homeschooling. They're not, because there is a financial incentive for your child going to school, and people don't realize that.
That you get no funding, nothing, you're on your own. But with Flexi Schooling, there is an implication, and it gets administratively messy. And secondly, the onus of your child's education has to lie with someone. If you're Flexi Schooling, it means the onus of your child's education is still with the school, but your child is not at school all the time. So how do they account for your child's performance? So these are the complications that makes it very hard for schools to want to say yes. The on which many schools will allow flexi schooling is if your child has special needs. So for example, if they are dyslexic or, you know, autistic, or any of these things where you need to take them out of school because they need to have extra services. Now, in our case, I think many people are homeschooling at the moment because of the pandemic. So schools are aware, and that's not what they want. So they are a lot more flexible and open to the idea of negotiating to keep them at school than they've been, say, 10 months ago. And also, I think I have the added advantage because I have been homeschooling before, so I didn't even want to put him in school. And he literally begged me and said, Mom, you know, you're very busy with Homegrown Sunshine. I just want to hang out with my friends. Can I just go in for 2 days a week? So he really goes to school to hang out with his friends.
To hang out.
Not really to do, I mean, it's a great school and I've had to negotiate, whereas with maths and English, we are on par anyway because we are doing what we need to do at home. But in terms of topics like geography and history, and these are the subjects that I love, I've had to kind of tune the topics to suit what school is doing, but it's my curriculum and how I do it. I just need to tell them that this is what we're doing.
Sure.
Make sure, and then the other thing I had to negotiate is also make sure that he does the homework. Now, the homework, he'd rather do the school homework than mine.
Yours. Is yours like of a higher standard, do you reckon?
And
there
also,
you go.
not just that, it's because I know what he's capable of. And
that's it. That's it.
To give me.
So you're going to push him that much more because you know he has the potential for it. Yeah.
And besides, I'm an African mum. That's what we do.
Yeah, it's in the blood. It's in the blood. No, 100%. And you talked about, the realities of being a single mum and homeschooling. That is not, a lot of people would not even think that's possible. And but the reality is it does come with its challenges. One of the things I feel with when you're homeschooling, I always say you see your children in HD because you're with them so much and you don't get a break from your children oftentimes. But what helps is the respite that I get when I'm like, okay, take your children, I need time, and so some mums, all single dads, for example, would not, they can't even comprehend how it's even doable when you don't necessarily have that option to be like, take the children. I had enough. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, look, I think one of the beautiful things that homeschooling has done for me and my child is that it's developed a bond between us and a friendship. And if anything, it is closed the gaps that I felt was beginning to occur because of school. So I'm able to be with him for days on end and we are okay because our relationship isn't just based on me doing academics with him. It's about us doing life together. And part of that is me teaching him how to understand how to be with me also and respect my own boundaries. So one of the first things we kind of negotiate with after we'd had social time with people, he wants to debrief. And that was something that I started. Like he wants to, so did you see that? And I would say yes, because I used to do that with him because I wanted to understand his socialization skills. Some of it I was just like, well, why do you do that when you're around other people?
Right.
Right. So he got used to the debriefing and I realized actually I need time to decompress before I debrief. Like I need time. If I've been out for 3 hours talking to other people, once they're gone, I need to be quiet a bit so my brain can rest. I used to struggle after we've had time with other people and he wants to talk and I'm like, baby, I cannot speak right now.
Yeah.
And he'd feel rejected, like I didn't want to talk to him or I didn't want to hear what he had to say. But this is something I had to really spend time explaining that, listen, darling, it's just that my own person, we've all been made differently. I'm an ambivert. I could do uber social, but I could also do hermit comfortably for days on end. And time with people, I need to be quiet to think, to hear God in my own head, to actually know what I'm feeling because I've absorbed all these other energies and all this stuff, and it took a while, but he understood that was also important for him also to cultivate a sense of quiet, to know what he really thinks before he voices it out. So it's these kind of things, or like, listen, if I'm reading, it's my reading time, Part of what I'm teaching my son at home is also to teach him to be independent, to understand himself, to learn how to what makes him tick and what doesn't. he's highly sensitive to outside stimulation. So the noise gets him hyper, too much light, or he's got some sensory needs, which my job is to teach him how to adapt himself to those sensory needs so that they are not driving who he is. He's himself, which means that he has to first understand me and understand himself and understand the environment. So I think this is what's beautiful about homeschooling, because I could do all of that, not just the academic. I can say, let's pause the books today and let's focus on this habit that you're developing that noise that you're making unnecessarily that is clouding the atmosphere in the house, which means that then we can coexist beautifully. If there are days where if I'm really busy and I have a deadline, I could say, honey, you're going to have to read today because I'm really busy, and we'll catch up tomorrow, and he gets it.
Yeah. And there is the flexibility to do that, and I think what's really, you've really touched on something in terms of, you talked about how you would pick up on certain character traits or social behaviors, and you think, okay, we need to address this, this needs to be dealt with. And I think this is one of the beautiful things I find in terms of homeschooling and also just being an invested parent, that you're thinking about this person, this child has to go out there into the world, and they have to manage situations, deal with people, circumstances, engage, and you're thinking about how they're going to do that. You're trying to put things into them so that they can navigate the world. And it's not just a matter, because you're not caught up in the busyness of things so much that you miss opportunities to do that. And as you said, you can actually pause and be like, okay, we're going to take this day out to deal with this issue. There is that time to really get to grips with those things. And I think that's it's one of the most incredible privileges I find when it comes to homeschooling, because you're really taking an active role in, doing the molding work now. And I say that carefully because I know that Charlotte Mason, who we're going to go on to, talks about, and you mentioned this about seeing your child as a whole person, and not necessarily trying to make them into something that, maybe you can actually articulate it better than I can, but I've started reading a book that was recommended after the last live. I can't remember what it's called now.
For children's sake.
That's it, for the children's sake. And that was one of the things that I picked up. And I know that you are, you lend quite heavily to Charlotte Mason's principles. And so could you tell us a bit more about what inspired that? What drew you to her, and a bit more about those ideas about approaching the child as a whole person? So
in my 3 weeks of sort of downloading everything I could find on homeschooling, I think the first book I read was Teaching from Rest by Sarah Mackenzie. She wrote Reading Aloud Revival. And she's one of these well-read books or well-known books in homeschooling community, and she talked about Charlotte Mason in the book, and the whole idea was really approaching homeschooling as a ministry, knowing that God is there with you in leading your child. And I needed to hear that. I mean, literally, I was a bit like Moses. Lord, if you don't go, I'm not going. Come with me. I'm not going on this. I'm gonna need grace. So that book, I just found it, and it spoke to me, and then opened up other books. And that's how I heard of Charlotte Mason. I also heard of Susan Bower Wise, who's done the classical, sort of the classical education guru of A Well-Trained Mind. So in fact, I went to that because I knew of classical education, more familiar with that. I went towards that first and read it. It's a massive, thick book. I've actually put together a little basket here of some of my homeschooling books.
Oh, wow. Look at that. My goodness.
Up-to-date version, but it's massive. Okay.
That is huge.
It's huge, but it's so practical. It's so easy to get through. And I cheated. I got the book, but I also listened to the book. So I was able to get through it really quickly.
Okay, right.
And it's full of resources, list and list and list. So it was hard to listen to because I'm just going to get the book because there were so many resources out here. But it was so detailed in the way it explained how homeschooling is done that it made it accessible to me. You know, the whole learning from reading and talking about books and classical education is a little bit more didactic in that, you know, you're memorizing and doing a lot of rote learning, but that sounds familiar to me. And I know my son has a brain for absorbing facts. All of that was attractive to me. But coming back to Charlotte Mason, it was the idea of morning time that initially drew me to Charlotte Mason. So I found a podcast. I think it was Cindy Rollins doing a talk at a conference about morning time. This was, I think it was just God's grace because I just found all the most important things.
Right.
But like that. Perhaps it's also the books that I read led me to other things. And I listened to this podcast. It must have been 20 years old, but it was kind of reproduced. You asked me where I've heard it. I can't remember, but it was her talking about morning time at a conference where she literally went through how she did morning time. So I just, again, literally absorbed that. So, oh, really? Is that all? I just need to read. I don't even have to explain a lot about what I'm reading. I just have to collect all my favorite things like poetry and songs and, you know, read out a chapter of a book together. Gosh, I do these things anyway. That concerted way. So great. This is fantastic. And I started doing it. So the more I did, the more I became curious about Charlotte Mason. And then another thing pushed me down this route again, which is that the local authority contacted me and said, we need to have your education philosophy, madam.
Right.
So okay. All right. I will give you one. So,
yeah.
I've heard about 2 so far. I don't really know what it's about, but then that catapulted me to dig deeper into learning what Charlotte Mason's philosophy was about. So I started reading. I went onto Ambleside. I looked at different blogs. I should have gone straight to Charlotte Mason's books, but I didn't because I looked at them and thought, she wrote in the 18th century. What's she going to tell me?
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
I wish I had, actually, because now I really enjoy reading her stuff. But as I look through the principles, it just resonated with me so beautifully. It made sense, and that how she talks about the Holy Spirit so explicitly in the role of educating, I just found that profound. Where she first saying that children are born persons, they are whole. They are uniquely made, and our job as parents or teachers or educators is to facilitate, to understand who that person is, and to facilitate an education that is aligned with who God has made that person to be. That just sounds so biblically profound.
Yeah.
How do you argue with that?
Yeah.
The whole thing about also, letting the child alone, that what you do as an educator is to facilitate this beautiful feast. Your job is to present different sources of education to the child and make it as good and solid and delectable as possible, and let the child chew on it, and let them have that moment where God connects the dots in their minds about what they're learning. Because really, Afia, who knows how we learn? Who knows have those aha moments?
Right.
I don't know. Scientists don't know. Yeah, even with the most thorough education, you just present the information. Some kids catch it, some don't, but you don't know how they do, right? So it's only their maker. And I think you do give space for the children to recognize their own agency in their learning when you leave them alone a little bit. You know, so my son, I'm really, really blessed because he's always been an avid reader. And so he took to that like a moth to a flame. He loved the whole idea of being able to be left alone to read stuff. But I knew that he could keep on reading and never know what he learned. That the whole thing was to come back and let's talk about it.
Dialogue,
The dialogue. So Charlotte Mason would advocate more for narration, where you ask them to narrate what they have learned. And that, I think, narration is easier when you start with the process from when they're little. It is harder for a child who's been at school and not been used to kind of narrating in that way. So we struggle with narration a little bit because he's got almost like a photographic memory where he'll remember everything word for word, and I'm going, oh my God, could you just summarize this?
It's too much.
I'm not telling you to tell me the thing script by script. I'm just like, just narrate the thing. So we struggle with that to begin with, but the idea of being able to tell me what he has learned, and when I did it in a dialogue fashion, it worked beautifully because, again, another Charlotte Mason principle is a science of relations, that when a child reads a book and a concept pricks their brain, it reminds them of something else, and then something else, and then they are connecting, and then the learning comes alive, and then there's passion. Now that is son. He will talk about the signs of relations, like that's how his brain is wired. So he'd read something, Mommy, but do you remember we read this in another book? And he could go to the book and find the exact page, and he will show me where he had read that other. Or the film that he saw, or the concept he saw outside, or the person that had said that, and his brain is going all over. And really see his eyes are popping, he's coming alive from just being exposed to something.
And absolutely. And I think what I really, really love is, when you look at people like Charlotte Mason and what they had to say in classical, a lot of the classical approaches towards education and so on, is that Christianity and God is not compartmentalized. So it's not the case where we go to school and then we learn RE and we learn about Christianity in RE as among other religions, and then and then we go to church, but it's literally like, do you know what? Education. The approach is almost that education is God-given. The ability to learn is God-given, and God is at the center of it, of it all. It doesn't have to be that he's removed, do you know what I mean, from the joy and the experience of learning. And I think that's what I really love, is that how everything is integrated, it's really quite powerful. And so you talked about morning time, and you actually created resources for morning time. And guys, I actually have, so you've already done, is it an autumn edition? And then you're now going to be releasing a winter. Okay, so Alberta's done an autumn edition, and you're soon to release a winter edition. And I do see your comments and questions, guys. I'm going to come to them, I promise. And so you've done an autumn edition, and you're going to be releasing a winter edition. And essentially, you talked about how this is the morning time resource is an opportunity to have time to unpick poetry and reading with your children and so on. Could you talk a bit more about it, and also stress the fact that it's not just for homeschool children, right? It's for all homes. So tell us a bit more about the concept of morning time, why it's so important, and what it all entails with your resources.
Wonderful, thank you, Afia. So morning time for me is this opportunity where a family comes together to learn holistically about the things that are most meaningful to them, and it's done in a form of reading aloud, singing aloud, and recitation. So this concept isn't necessarily unique to Charlotte Mason or homeschooling. It is something that some people do in their homes anyway. Some people call it circle time, family time. Some people, schools call it assembly time. It's where you're sensing and you're validating what is important in your home or in your school or community and culture. And that's why I label my resource liturgy. It's a form, it's a ceremony of coming together and making sense of what is important. And in this, there is a menu of things that you go through. So it could start with prayer, it could start with meditation, and then you're looking at singing. So if you are a religious person, this is a great opportunity to teach your children the love of God, not in a functional, dry way, but in a way that makes sense, that it's something sweet and enjoyable. If you, as a home educator, is a way of really bringing the love of learning and wonder and curiosity, because you're not learning to pass a test, you're not learning because you have to tick a box or workbook, you're just sitting together, and often could be playing and having their hands busy or knitting or creating something, and mum or dad is reading aloud. So it's really a quiet time of bringing in prayer, hymns, folk songs, empowerment songs or pop songs, whatever we want to call them, poetry, fables, and also reading literature, classical literature, or living books, as you may want to call them. Now, the time this could take is really down to you and the age range of the child. I would say if you have very young children, sort of under 5, 30 minutes is more than you need. If the child is older and you have more of a flexible homeschooling schedule, then an hour and a half is more than enough. And it really just depends on you. So when I started homeschooling, this became an anchor for us because I loved it. It fed my soul. Like I didn't need to have extra quiet time, because not only was I able to bring our own devotion. Are you there? So I could also explore poetry and hymns, things that could play in my mind. Charlotte Mason calls it, you furnish your mind, almost like your mind becomes this gallery of painting, like throughout the day, rather than you hearing, I just want to roll it all day. Whatever the song is, you don't need to trying to kill you, just want to.
Yeah.
You then have a broader repertoire, because you get what you put in, right? If you're putting beauty, truth, and goodness, you're going to get that. When their mind is right, this is what's going to come out. And I know one of the things I still remember from going to a Christian Methodist school is that those hymns, I'm just surprised when sometimes I'd be going through stuff and a hymn will just pop up in my head, and it's encouraging, so timely. So something of feeding the soul, or poetry that through repetition, not because you've got to learn this and recite it next week when we have our meeting, but you're just hearing it, and you're hearing the cadence, and you're hearing the rhyme, and you're hearing the words, and before you know, the kids pick it up like they do the songs in the car. Repetition.
Mm-hmm.
Or they'll remember a line, or they'd hear a line in a poem, and then they'll go outside and they see the phenomenon of what they read in the poem, and then all of a sudden able to find a language already to connect to the experience that they've just had.
Right.
And what became more fascinating for me at morning time was how I use this time to teach my son his cultural identity. I was telling him, Brian Nancy stories from when I was little, or folk songs, Creole folk songs, and he became fascinated with learning Creole, which is my language, And he will do so confidently, or he'd want me to teach him games that I learned when I was a kid, So things like that. And this was what was connecting us, because all of a sudden he got to see Mummy as a child, felt connected with me because I was bringing that part of myself that he didn't know, because all he experienced was me sort of being very English and going through life, but there was this depth to myself that I brought, my authentic self, to the table to say, here's a song my grandmother taught me, and here's a story, and here let me, and all of a sudden he wants to know more Brown Nancy stories. And in fact, once I read the story, he wanted to retell the story himself with his own Wakandan accents, and I'm like, I don't know what accent that is.
Wakandan. And you know what, what you said really resonates with me, because just a few days ago we were driving, and there was a poppy that was attached to the lamppost, and the children were asking me what that was, and I had to, of course, explain why we wear poppies. And then I said, do you want to learn more about this? And they said, yes. So I thought, okay, great. We're going to do it in morning time. So then I then remembered the poem In Flanders Field Where Poppies Grow. And it was a poem that I learned at school. And it was a war. It was to do with the war and all. And again, it took me back to my childhood, and I learned this at school, and this, do you know what I mean? And so you're absolutely right in terms of you're able to kind of use that opportunity to really connect with your child, and and have them see you as a child, and I love that. I think you put that really, really well, and I do definitely relate to that. And what I really like about your resources as well is the culture that you said it brings. Because I'll be honest, when I looked at a lot of the classical curriculums and the Charlotte Mason curriculums, I never really considered them. I didn't consider them because I almost kind of I kind of felt like they couldn't be applied to my children, because my children are of African heritage, and I felt like maybe they weren't really written for them, they weren't designed for them, and they weren't written with them in mind. And so I didn't look into them. I honestly didn't even consider them. Then I think it was on the basis of like your resource, and also on the last live that we did, and speaking to you and hearing that actually no, like we can take elements of what is being taught and integrate it with our own ideas and what's important to us, and it can absolutely apply to all children, no matter what. And I love the fact that you incorporate culture into your resources. I think that's amazing.
Definitely. I think I'm going to draw a line for a friend of mine, homeschooling mom. She's amazing. If you don't follow her, do. Her name is Amber Johnston, and she's a Heritage Mom blog, or Heritage Mom. And she says in her home, Charlotte Mason wears an afro. And I just think it's so beautifully said. Right?
Love it.
Charlotte Mason, I think one of the things I love about her is that her principles are universal. They're not meant to be set in stone. And her whole idea of living books is that, so the child is immersed in a context. I know she's very pro-British and very nationalistic, and she's a byproduct of her time, 18th century slavery. is very Victorian and all of those things, right? And very, very middle class. But really, hey, we live in a global world. We are byproduct of that same culture. We were, look at us. We're bicultural, whether we like it or not.
Absolutely.
So let's not even try. There will never be a time where we can extricate Western education completely. Even if you're in Africa, you are given that. Most of Africa still do a classical education. You know? So that's how it is, and we can't. It has become ours too. The onus, however, is for us to personalize it, because, hey, isn't that what we do with the Bible? We personalize it. It's it was never done in the context in Greek. You know, we've taken that and appropriated it and made it our own. Why can't we do this? If you tell me to read living books, and you tell me that reading aloud is important, and you tell me that reading about culture and fantasy and moral imagination is important, first thing that comes to mind, listen, I grew up with that from my grandmother, who is completely illiterate, can't read or write, but that woman was a griot. She talked in stories. She had a story or a parable for everything. Song that came with it. So I grew up with that, but I learned to discard that so that I can read my Jane Austen novels and run to that instead. So when I read Charlotte Mason, I just thought, oh my goodness, this is what my grandmother taught me.
Yes.
To pass this on. And all the stories. Another thing also is Aesop's Fables. I mean, Aesop's Fables became a staple very, very early on in our morning time, because it's short and snappy, but it's so insightful in terms of the morality that came with the story. And it forces my son to think outside of the box. It's not literal. It's not logical, scientific, which he naturally gravitates. So he has to think. Soon he began to map the patterns, and he could interpret them really quickly. The more I read them, I thought, but these are like African stories. And you know what, Afia? I have now got a huge collection of African folk tales. And what I've even done in my resource is that I have linked all my African stories to mirror Aesop's Fables, because they are all stories anyway, and legend has it that Aesop was an African slave that was taken to Rome. So it makes sense to me that they are African stories that have been and made Western. Yeah,
perhaps. Interesting.
And even the Gruffalo. I remember reading when my son was 1 or 2, reading the Gruffalo, and I thought, this sounds like an African story, like an African folktale. Because really think about it, it's about craftiness. It's about fooling an oppressor. That is
It sounds like a very Nancy story, you know.
It's a very Nancy story. So we've just got to flip this thing on its head and recognize, actually, this is who we are. This is what we were raised with. I mean, often you know that you understand a language when you begin to understand its idioms and parables. That is, then you're speaking the language. Americans are not literal, they're very idiomatic.
Yes, 100%. And what we always, you know, what I always say is that ultimately in our home, we are Christians first, and then we are Africans, and then we are anything else, you know. And what I love about the fact is that Charlotte Mason was a God-fearing woman, and that she was a Christian, and she did not shy away from that. She did not dilute it in any way. She was very, you know, very upfront, you know, and very open about, you know, her faith, and it really just wove its way into everything that she communicated and everything that she said, and that is the key thing. It's so integral, you know. So yes, that
said that so beautifully. But can I just say, somebody just said the first time they heard the Gruffalo, they thought it was so Zimbabwean.
It's true though. It's true. It's so true.
So true. I thought so too. But again, yeah, you're so right. And Charlotte Mason has given me the permission to be open about my faith in my education, because again, that's something that I learned to sort of keep to myself. My faith is personal, and I taught my son very early, don't talk about religion to anybody. Just don't go there.
We don't want problems.
You know. So yeah. But looking at Charlotte Mason, but even classical education is very much attuned to that in terms of exploring truth, goodness, and beauty is all aligned with truth being Christ and God being the orchestrator of beauty and all of that. So for me, it's given me a language to express what I know to be true. And it's given me lenses through which to see the world and learn about the world through my faith rather than compartmentalizing them.
Yeah.
And that is the freedom that I have received through homeschooling, that I have found a language to see the world holistically based on what I believe, and and talk about it in an educated way rather than thinking, oh, I could only talk about this with my Christian friends. I'll talk about even creation. You know, we have to, because we're learning science and
absolutely
as a scientific mind, and we had to look at all of that, like, well, how do we explain the Bible and what science is saying, so that there is no cognitive dissonance and it's going, well, Mum, you said this, but the science book says that. Your faith begins to dwindle, right? Homeschooling gave me that platform where I had to find a way to reconcile and learn this stuff myself.
Yes.
You can talk about it and say, well, look, everything that science expresses, the Bible's also expressed it, but figuratively, not
literally. Come on,
you will see it.
Yeah.
And for me to be on Instagram talking live and being able to talk about homeschooling and my faith in such an intertwined way, because I've been able to sit on the shoulders of giants who've done this. When the resources that I've written, Liturgy of Love, it's a resource for both homeschoolers and non-homeschoolers, anybody who wants to educate their child, for themselves. This is a resource that, gives you the if you like, the language and the tools to do that. And I've written it not just for Christians, because, I have placed it in a way that you can go through it and skip the faith parts and do the secular parts, but it still gives space for parents to, feel confident to teach their children what they believe. I really don't believe schools look at the whole person. It's often, I find that education's now limited to teaching kids skills, and everything else, is your own business. How you good person, and what is goodness? Who can decide? Nobody wants to judge what is good and what is bad. There is no moral education. All of that. So I think we do our children a disservice to not bring these conversations to the table to make sense of how all things are connected.
And so with this resource, what a parent would essentially do is it would give them step by step on a day-to-day basis, am I right? The resources with which they could have that time to sit down with their children and pick from poetry, pick from stories, wholesome stories, what Charlotte Mason describes as living books, and songs, am I right, as well, and have that time of bonding and really just kind of, I like what Kat said, lighting a fire, not filling a bucket. It's a really precious time, and what it's doing is it's given parents the opportunity to not have to now go and search out all of these resources themselves. It's there for you, already packaged. And what I read in your when I read the autumn edition is, you know, you mentioned, you know, having a hot drink, you know, a blanket, some plants on a tray. And I did exactly that. I did exactly as you said it. You know, I was like, right, this is what Alberta said to do, so I'm going to do it.
Candles.
Yeah, oh, I missed the candles, but girl, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do it next week. I'm on it. And they loved it. They absolutely loved it, and that is what they look forward to now every day. That I was doing morning time, you know, and I just thought, wow, this is incredible. But for a parent whose child goes to school, and perhaps they don't have that time in the morning, how would they use the resource? What would you recommend for that situation?
Thank you so much, Hafia. And I think morning time, even though it says morning time, ironically could be done anytime. And some people don't necessarily do the whole of morning time as I present it in one sitting. Some people will do their poetry at a separate time in the afternoon with afternoon tea, called poetry tea time, you know. And some people do their reading aloud of their living book or classical book at a different time of the day. So it doesn't have to be done in the mornings.
Okay.
You could do it at dinner time. And evening times are also a beautiful time to do morning time because you're right around the table, and the kids could be again doing something with their hands. I think that whole thing, there's a lot of research as well about, you know, your brain absorbing when your hands are busy. Minimizes the chances of them running around aimlessly, which I don't mind if my son runs around whilst I read, as long as he's within earshot, because I know he's still listening. But often he doesn't do that anyway. Lego was my friend with morning time. I'd just put out the Lego box and he would do Lego, or, you know, I'd give him clay and he would create something with his hands, or he'll do art. As long as it's like, even adults, we doodle, right, when we're in meetings and we're listening.
Yes, very true.
And you'd be amazed that you remember everything. And whilst you read a lot, and I think there is just something really powerful about a parent's voice. That when you are able to translate these powerful and beautiful words through your own voice, it becomes second nature to the child. It makes the things that you are teaching and the concepts almost immediately relatable to the child because it's passed through mommy's lips. You know, it isn't foreign. It isn't like, oh, that's over there. Because it's now got your accents, your inflections, and it's your words. And it isn't, I mean, I know many people who've used my resource a lot of the time have come back and said, oh, my child was able to write their own poetry, or they are now, you know, I think even Tombra's kids, we did the doxology, and the next thing they were writing a verse of their own, added to the doxology. And it isn't about me, it's the fact that it became accessible. Right. I could do this too. It's easy. You know, it's not foreign that you have to go to music school to start writing lyrics to a song, because you now see this thing. And copywriting, even, you know, you're listening to a poem, you like it, and you ask your child to just copy the words of that poem. That is a very easy way to memorize the words of a poem, or even a scripture. There's also something that I put in the book. I have thematic, in a liturgy of love, thematic scriptures. So October we were looking at kindness, November we're going to be looking at thanksgiving, and obviously Advent is more focused on Christ. So, and each time you'd have a scripture. Just copywriting is a way of practicing handwriting, but it's also a way of keeping the words in your heart. You know, like, and she kept the words in her heart. That's a way of storing beautiful, life-giving words in your heart. Yes. Later, you know, or poetry. Maybe I know Leah Bowden talks about something that she practices, which is that, you know, she'll ask her children to take a line out of a poem and illustrate that line, their favorite line. So not necessarily the whole thing. But then you get a poetry journal, like you would have a nature journal or an art book. So many things that you could take from just this 1 hour experience that could actually become a whole day of learning if that's what you want.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are interested, Alberta sells these, and so you can purchase them. If you go on her Instagram, there's a link to her website. And so not only does she provide this resource, but she actually provides consultation services for people who are interested in homeschooling. And with this resource, it's £30, isn't it?
It is £28 for 3 months. But
for 3 months. So technically it's like less than £10 a month, which is not bad at all. It's actually a bargain, and so I really recommend it. I wanted to also address a question that came through. It's from Kat, and she said some people think that Charlotte Mason is unschooling, but can you explain a bit about how they differ?
Okay, that's a really good question.
And you're gonna have to do it in like 3 minutes because we've got 4 minutes left.
Very good. I'll be quick. So Charlotte Mason isn't, as far as I know, unschooling to be, it's following the interest of your child, and allowing your child to a large extent to determine what they're learning. Obviously, I don't think it necessarily means that the child just does whatever they want, but to a large extent it is driven by the child's interest. I think Mason differs because there is still an expectation that the parent determines what is delectable, what is good for presents the child, and there is still that accountability that the child narrates back to the parent, and I think the parent is a facilitator and sees themselves as a custodian, on behalf. God is the ultimate, but the parent is there as a custodian to guide the child in the way of the Lord. So it isn't leaving the child to do whatever they want. I mean, I think, some people say homeschooling isn't that either, but to a large extent it is assuming that the child knows what they want, knows what's, they learn based on interest, and if they're interested in something, they'll learn it. If they're not, then don't present it to them. Struggle with that. It's best for you. I mean, when it comes to project-based learning, I do unschool. When it comes to my son's interests, like, music production and things like that, I don't get involved, but if there are potential grades involved, I do get involved, because if I do whatever he wanted, he wouldn't do much.
This is it. Come on now.
So, and there's money involved and time. So exactly. I would distinguish between, but it is in the spectrum. I would say Charlotte Mason is in the middle. Classical education is at the sort of extreme of, the parent determines, or the leader or teacher determines what is taught and is taught in a didactic way, where Charlotte Mason has a little bit of leeway in the middle of allowing the child some space to work through what they're learning and talk back. There's a bit more autonomy, whereas unschooling is at the far end of kind of letting the child direct to a large extent their interest. There's a lot of learning that happens that way too. That's if you don't mind what the outcome is.
Because it has to be comfortable for you as the parent as well as it works for your child. Yes, and I do find that when you're homeschooling as a parent, you are naturally drawn to certain, certain methods and certain approaches, depending on, do you know what I mean, your own personality and that sort of thing. So no, that's amazing. No, you haven't riveted, Kat. Your contributions have been amazing, and guys, you've been on fire. Like, there's been so much engagement and so many comments, throughout the whole live from lots of people. I think people have really gained so much value from this. You've been getting lots and lots of hearts as well. Guys, I did promise you that she's extremely eloquent, and you heard yourself. You know, honestly, like, I don't know how you're not the journalist for, you know, the BBC or something, because the way that you put things is just so beautiful. And I really do recommend that you do, you know, check out Alberta and her services as well. If you're interested in homeschooling, I think she's very much able to, like, what you kind of just help people to find what works for them, the approach that's right for them. Am I right in saying that, Alberta?
That is exactly what I do. I have a sort of mixture of classical education, Charlotte Mason, and a little bit of unschooling, actually, even in my own homeschool. So I don't look at any one particular approach. My job is to help you find what works for you. I've even explored Montessori and Waldorf for clients in the past. So yeah, I explore whatever it takes for you to find your own unique homeschooling journey.
Amazing, amazing. And I'm absolutely going to be purchasing the winter edition of the Morning Time Resource, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I'd like to thank you for just taking the time to create something like that. I think is absolutely amazing. People are, you know, the comments are coming in, they're saying massive well done, it's been wonderful. Yep, she is very articulate, Kat. Absolutely. You know, people are thanking, and honestly, I just want to thank you so much for honoring the invitation. I've learned so much, I've gained so much. I am going to keep the live on the page, everybody, so that you can go back and watch it all. If you didn't catch the beginning, for example, you can send it to friends and so on, so that they can also get to hear it. And I'm going, and if you don't mind, you had that whole basket of books. If you don't mind sending me the titles and the authors, I'm going to write them in the description below. So these are recommended books, right?
Yes, definitely. I mean, they're all not necessarily typically homeschooling. There's some Charlotte Mason in there. There is Sally Clarkson, Karen Glass, the big Ken Ludwig on how to do Shakespeare. And I have some non-homeschooling books there, but education, sort of creative learning, the Wonder Approach, which is about curiosity and learning out in the world as opposed to screen. So it's all to do with learning, really.
Right.
Not everything is homeschooling.
Yes, so I'm going to put them in the description box below. And Kat also had another book recommendation that she put in the comments, and I'm trying to scroll up to find it, but I can't. So Kat, if you don't mind messaging me that book as well, I'm also going to put that in the description when I post it onto the page.
I take a photo and send you a photo, and you could
Yes, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. Well, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you for allowing us to spend this evening with you and to talk education, to talk homeschooling, to talk parenting. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too. And do all have an absolutely amazing, educating the wholehearted child. Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna put that in. I'm gonna put that in, Kat. All right. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, everybody. And bye, Alberta. It's gonna cut off now.
It's been a pleasure.
All right. Take care. Thank you. Bye.